Hi there. We're going to go through another PowerPoint now, another narrated PowerPoint based on CC4, production costs and revenue. And remember the last one, we got to the point where your self-study activity was to look at Malthus's view on diminishing returns. Excuse me. And then there were three questions that I wanted you to have a go at answering. So we're going to go through some of the responses that you could have included there. And obviously you can add to your initial thoughts based on the slides that we're going to run through. So the first question we asked was what did Malthus predict would be the result from population growth, and his view was that that could have created starvation and famine. And based on the fact that obviously if you've got populations that are growing geometrically, food production might only increase arithmetically. So clearly that could cause a bit of an issue, to say the least. Why have his predictions not yet come true? Well, technology has clearly improved. So agricultural machinery has boosted productivity, which has obviously helped in terms of production of food, etc. Genetically modified crops have been introduced, which obviously give much greater yields, and irrigation has improved. So obviously that means that you can be more productive in terms of your land use. And fertilizers clearly have become more sophisticated, although clearly fertilizers are a bit of an issue in terms of the some of the chemicals that they may include. So that's something to bear in mind too. And then obviously we've got hydroponics, where we're using the use of water and hydroponic technology in order to improve the yields of food production. So does that actually prove his theory wrong? The third question. Well, not really, no, because it's just not that applicable in this case, because the land in this case is obviously a variable. And we also need to bear in mind that in terms of diminishing returns to scale, this is actually a short-run concept, and it doesn't assume any technological change has gone on. And clearly that has been a significant change in lots of different market sectors and industries, and particularly in the agricultural sector. So let's take a look at this principle of the diminishing returns to scale and show it on a diagram, so that you've got some sort of way of showing that. So on page 17 you've got a couple of examples or a couple of graphs that are left there for you to fill in. So here is the first example. So I'm just going to draw these individually, and then we can talk about essentially what this is showing us. So we've got a number of different points being shown here. So diminishing returns start to operate when we're talking about reaching point A, and up to that point, the slope of the total returns or the total product curve has been increasing and moving from point to point up the curve. But once it gets to the point where, excuse me, we get past A, it starts to show diminishing returns. Okay, so prior to that, it's showing that the labour force is benefiting from increasing marginal returns. So the extra person in the labour force has helped to actually improve the overall level of production. When we start to get towards diminishing marginal returns, the total returns curve, as you can see in the green, the total returns curve here, does continue to rise for a short period of time, whilst more workers are combined with capital. But obviously that point at which it starts to become less steep shows that there is going to be a change, so to speak. So, and the point where we are talking about Y here, okay, that's the point at which the total returns start to fall. As you can see, we're starting to see that it's starting to fall, and then essentially the total returns start to fall overall. Okay. At that point, if we're starting to get to total returns, so output starting to fall, then clearly there seems to be very little point in employing more staff or adding more additional workers, because essentially the marginal returns to labour have become negative, and obviously that's a point at which you wouldn't want to necessarily you clearly wouldn't carry on employing more staff because you're starting to lose efficiencies. So that's the first diagram. If we then look at marginal returns and average returns shown on a diagram, which is similar to the same sort of thing that we just talked about, let's just show what that looks like then. Same sort of principle in this case. What we're doing is we're plotting output against the number of workers employed, and we're showing, as I'll just bring these up together, and then we can obviously talk through the point at which marginal returns and obviously average returns are shown on the graph. Okay, and then in terms of this, the points that we're actually showing, the point at which we're talking about at point B is where the law of diminishing returns start to set in. Okay, so the highest point of the marginal returns curve. At that point, once we get past that point, we're starting to see essentially a less efficient scenario going on. Okay, so to the left of that point, we've got increasing marginal returns, and that's shown by the increasing marginal returns curve. But the point of diminishing returns averages and starts to look at the average returns of labour is located at that higher point of the average returns curve at C. So that's the point at which we start to see a significant fall in average returns, clearly caused by the fall in marginal returns too. And finally, the point at which marginal returns become negative is the point beyond which the curve gets past the point W. Okay, so at that point there, effectively, we're getting negative marginal returns. But that's showing all of the info that we talked about and have shown on some of the graphs that you've drawn previously. That's just encapsulating that in terms of one graphical diagram. Okay, so that's page 17 completed. We're now going to move on and look at a couple of things. One is returns to scale, which is something that is included on page 18. So there are some definitions there of returns to scale, and they range from increasing, constant, and decreasing returns to scale. So each one has been defined within the booklet, which hopefully is pretty much self-explanatory. Okay, so we're now going to move on and start to look at cost of production. Okay, so this is a new section within the booklet, within CC4, and it starts on page 19. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at again is the specification, what you're being asked to understand about cost of production. And there are some examples where we're going to have to work through some information and show how costs of production are calculated. Okay, so in terms of what you need to know, first things first, you need to understand the difference between the short run and the long run in terms of cost of production. You're certainly going to need to understand the difference between marginal, average, and total costs. And some of these terms might get a bit confusing, but I think as you go through and start to work through some of the examples, they start to become much more clear. Okay, but hopefully that will make sense as we go through some of these presentations. We need to also look at not just the difference between the short run and the long run, but also the difference between short run and long run costs. And like we've mentioned in economics, the argument is that in the long run, all costs are variable. Now, that's not something that you would normally expect or consider to happen in business terms, but in terms of economics, because like we said before, essentially every factor of production can be adjusted. And so as a result of that, in the long run, all costs or all factors of production can be or will be variable costs, because obviously they can change. We'll look at the reasons why there are different shapes for the marginal, average, and total cost curves, and show that with some example diagrams. And then we're also going to look at how factor prices and productivity affect a firm's cost of production, and that obviously then affects their choice of factor inputs too. And those clearly are things that will influence production decisions and also production costs for an organisation. We'll also need to be able to calculate different costs from given data, and in some cases you might need to either draw or interpret cost curves, and that's something again that we'll give you plenty of practice in over the next few pages within the booklet. Okay, so we talked about the production process in a little bit of detail previously, and in essence we're going to look at both production in the short term and also in the longer run too. But in essence we've got this process going on. So effectively we've got inputs or factors of production that are being put into the process, if you like, and those are the four items: land, labour, capital and enterprise. So we're basically taking those four factors of production and we're combining them in different ways, putting it through a factory process or a production process in this instance to essentially generate an output of goods or services for sale in markets. So effectively we've got inputs coming in that are being managed by enterprising individuals or firms, and then basically combining land, labour, capital and enterprise in different ways to actually provide output of goods and services for sale in markets. Okay, now there is a nice, quite a nice short video for you to take a look at, which again just talks in a little bit more detail about that whole process. But that essentially is the production process. And when we start to look at cost of production, that's where we're breaking the cost of production down to demonstrate, number one, how we might be able to reduce or manage the production costs, and obviously in some cases use that as an opportunity to gain some competitive advantage over our competitors, because if we can produce stuff cheaper and more cost effectively than others, that might mean that we can either make more profit or sell at a lower price and still make a profit. Okay, so that model basically is quite an important process for you to understand. You don't need to show it graphically like that as such, but it seems to make some sense to show it in that way to sort of hopefully explain the whole process. So if we then take a look at the bottom of page 19, just below the example of the drawing we've just gone through, you can also show the production function as a formula, as a function. But to be honest, output basically is a function of N, L and K, where we're talking about land being N, labour being L and capital being K. So basically, in order to produce output, we have to combine labour, capital and land, and obviously in order to do that we also need to bear in mind that there is some issue in terms of the ways in which we might be able to increase the output for the firm, and that obviously is to do with increasing the factor inputs that we bring together. And as we've mentioned before, when we're talking about economics in particular, a short run is a period over which at least one factor of production is fixed. Okay, so we mentioned before that in the long run, in economics terms, that every factor of production is variable. But if we're talking about the short run, it's a period of time where at least one of the factors of production is a fixed cost. It's not going to change as such. Okay, certainly in the short run. So there's another video that I'd like you to take a look at, which actually just talks and shows a small business, and it actually explains a number of things like the firm's inputs and the outputs, what the fixed outputs are, what the variable inputs are, and I want you to spend a bit of time just getting your head around that, and then consider some of the some examples of fixed costs, of variable costs and of semi-variable costs. So if we take a look at fixed costs as a starting point, again, in general terms, they are things that will not change in the short term. So rent, insurance, and salaries they're going to be consistent costs. They're not going to change. They're not going to change with output as such. So any fixed cost is not going to change with the level of output that you're producing. Variable costs clearly will change with the amount of output that you're producing. So if we take raw materials or packaging or 0 hours wages or piece rates, they clearly are going to change dependent on the amount of output that we're actually producing. So they would be considered to be variable costs. You can get what are known as semi-variable costs. Now, I don't necessarily think you need to know this, but it's quite useful, and you will see that in some textbooks that they talk about semi-variable costs. And it's where you've got something like utilities or electricity, where you've essentially got what's known as a standing charge, which essentially is almost like a fixed cost. So it's not going to vary with the amount of electricity that you use, but the units that you use clearly will vary. So there are, again, a range of costs that you can consider to be semi-variable. Another one is employee remuneration, where we're talking about salespeople. They might have a basic salary that they receive, but they might also receive commission if they do well and make significant amounts of sales. Okay, so a few examples there of fixed costs, variable costs, and also semi-variable costs. Now, as you can see, you've got some definitions on page 20 which talk to you in a little bit more detail about this principle of fixed costs or indirect or overhead costs, variable or direct or prime costs, and then also there's an activity for you to consider where I want you to have a think about becoming a restaurateur for the day or the week or the year, whatever. But I want you to break down the different types of costs that you might have for running a restaurant, and I want you then to try and consider which are fixed and which are variable. So variable costs are those that will change with the level of output. Fixed costs are those that will not change dependent on the level of output. Okay, so on page 21 there is a table for you to consider, and I just want you to jot down a few ideas. You might need to do a little bit of research, you might need to do a little bit of reading around that concept, but I'd like you just to have a go at trying to break that down. Okay, so I'd suggest you stop the video at this point, or the narrated PowerPoint at this point, and then have a go at completing that table, both in terms of fixed costs and variable costs. Okay. So looking at this in a bit more detail, then let's take a look at some fixed costs that a restaurant might face. Rent is definitely one. Rates would be another, where we're talking about business rates. Insurance, so every business needs to be insured. Then it might be public liability, it might be insurance for the premises, etc. But those costs are going to stay the same in the short term because they're not going to vary with the amount of output that we're producing. Okay, another example could be a manager's salary. We know what a manager's salary is going to be. That is not going to change from one sort of month to the next. It's probably going to stay consistent for at least a year. But when we look at some variable costs, we obviously got food and drink. So if we sell more food, or we get more people coming into our restaurant, then we're clearly going to need to buy more food and also more drink. So they would both be variable costs. Where we've got hourly wages or staff wages, again, dependent on how good we are at managing that process, we might actually find that our staff wages are going to be variable, dependent on the number of people that are in the restaurant. Serviettes would be another example. So they're clearly consumables that we would need to buy more of if we have more people coming into our restaurant. Laundry, clearly, again, of tablecloths and napkins. Again, if the more times that we get people coming into our restaurant, and the more covers that we are able to get through during each sitting, then clearly that obviously would have some variable cost implications too. Okay, so the next thing I want you to take a look at is the way in which different types of cost are calculated. Okay, so if we take a look on page 22, we've got some definitions of total cost, of total variable cost, total fixed cost, average total cost, and also output. So there are definitions included there, but what I'd like you to consider is doing some cost calculations based on some of the information that we've already been given, okay? And then plot some of these cost axes on the same set of axes. So in terms of the thing to bear in mind, when we're talking about total cost, okay, so the total cost for production for a particular company would be the total variable cost, TVC, added to the total fixed cost. Okay, another way in which you can calculate that is to take the average total cost and times that by the quantity that we're talking about. Okay, now again, just to give you an idea of the different terminology that you could use, so average total cost, the way in which you'd calculate that, you take your total cost and divide that by your quantity, and that would equal the same, it's basically the same as your total variable cost added to your total fixed cost divided by the overall quantity. So there are a number of calculations that you will need to do on the basis of that. Okay. So if we take a look at that first table on page 22, you'll see that you've been given some information already. So you've got output per week at 0 through to 5. We then got total variable cost for one unit of output per week, which is £200, 2 being 300, etc. So you can see that the variable cost, the cost of the total variable cost, is changing with the level of output, like we've said before. Okay. Now, in this instance, we've been given that information, but we could actually calculate, or should be able to calculate, the rest of that table quite easily. Now, the reason that I say that is that if we're talking about a fixed cost, well, by the very nature of that, that fixed cost is not going to change. Okay, so if we actually then add these things in, the fixed cost is going to stay the same for each level of output, because like we've said, fixed costs don't change with the level of output. Now, the total cost, where we're talking about the excuse me, the total variable cost plus the total fixed cost, is obviously going to be a slightly different scenario. So if we actually take a look at this and go through the same process, or the same calculation process, the first thing that we can see is that even at no output, we've still got fixed costs that we have to incur. So even though we produce nothing in this scenario, we've still actually had to spend £200 worth of £200 on fixed costs, total fixed costs. If we then look at the output per week, we've then got to add our fixed cost, our total fixed cost, to our total variable cost. So that gives us an overall total cost of 400. At 2 units of our output per week, we've got to add 300, which is our total variable cost, to 200, which is our fixed cost, which gives us 500. And you can see that then follows on. So 800 is your total cost for 3 units of output per week. 1400 is the number of units. 1400 is the cost for 4 units of output, and 2,200 is the cost for 5 units of output. So if you haven't actually already calculated that, obviously add those into your booklets. We'll make some changes to those that table on page 22, because you're going to need to use that to then plot some of the data that we've just discovered. Okay. So in terms of the questions then, why is there a cost of £200 when the output is 0? Well, costs that are necessary to operate a business, like rent, and salaries, we have to incur irrespective of whether we produce any output. So that's the reason why in this instance, even though we produce nothing, we've still got fixed costs, which obviously cause a bit of an issue. So let's take a look at what this would look like in terms of plotting this information. And as you can see in this instance, what we've done is we've taken the information that we've actually calculated, and then we've plotted the average variable cost, the total variable cost, the total fixed cost, and also the total cost overall. And you can see that basically our total fixed cost is always going to be a horizontal line because it's not going to vary. So you can see it's a horizontal line that runs across like so. And then obviously, as you'd expect, given the nature of the total variable cost, which obviously is increasing with output, then the total cost, the overall total cost is clearly then going to reflect that in terms of the shape of the graph. Okay, so that's basically what your graph should look like on the bottom of page 22. Okay, so now we're going to look at some average costs. So we've talked about total variable cost, we've talked about total fixed cost, and we've talked about how you calculate the total cost by adding total variable cost and total fixed cost together. But the average total cost is something that, again, we need to consider, and that's on page 23 in your booklets. There's a definition there which states that the average cost of production per unit is calculated by dividing the total cost by the quantity produced, and that's equal to the average variable cost plus the average fixed cost. Okay, so there are different ways of calculating this, but in this instance, if we're looking at average total cost, we can show that as either ATC or as AC, and in essence, to calculate the average total cost, we're going to take total cost and divide that by the quantity. Okay, and there are a number of different ways in which you can then show that. You might choose to add the total variable cost to the total fixed cost and then divide that by the quantity, and there's a range of different options that you can consider, but fundamentally what we're talking about here is trying to calculate the average total cost. Okay, and that's considering average fixed cost, average total cost, adding those together, and actually then showing the average total cost, which is an important principle to consider. Okay, so in this case, I want you to use the information that previously you've used in the table, but now we want to actually consider the average total cost as well. Okay, so we can calculate the average variable cost, the average fixed cost, and also the average total cost. But obviously be careful when we're talking about dividing by 0, particularly on line 1. So obviously in the first instance, for our output per week of 0, we've got no average variable cost at all. We have, in terms of our average fixed cost, if in terms of the figures that we've got there, effectively, if we're then dividing fixed cost by in this case the quantity, well, we haven't produced a quantity, so effectively the average fixed cost is also 0, and then so the average total cost is also nothing on that basis. When we start to then look at in this case the average variable cost, though, okay, we've got the original figure of 200, and we've divided that by 1, which is the level of output per week, to get a value of 200 for our average variable cost. Now, in the second instance, where we've got effectively that £300 figure of total variable cost, in this instance, where we're now talking about 2 units of output per week, then the overall average variable cost comes down to 150. When we look at the third example, where we've essentially got 600 average variable cost divided by 3 units of output, so in that instance our average variable cost has gone back up slightly to 200. And then when we get into 4 units of output per week, our average variable cost has again gone up significantly based on that, and that we're now talking about average variable costs of 300. And finally, we've got the last unit where we're talking about the total of 2,000 of your total variable cost divided by your output per week to get your average variable cost of £400. Okay. If we then take a look at, in this instance, the average fixed cost, where we're taking the average fixed cost of £200 per month, per week in this situation. When we divide that by 200 by the 1 unit of output per week, that gives us an average fixed cost of 200. But then when we take that same figure and divide it by 2, that brings the average fixed cost down to 100. When we then add in our third example, again, the fixed costs stay the same, but basically we reduce the average fixed cost down to 67, and then down to 50 for 4 units of output, and then 40 for 5 units of output. So clearly, if we've got fixed costs that are fixed, then clearly the more output we produce, the less the average fixed cost is, because it's spread across more units. If we then look at our average total cost then, okay, in this instance we've got an average fixed cost of 200, we've got an average variable cost of 200, so that gives an average total cost of 400. Obviously comes down quite significantly when we add in another unit of output, because effectively we've got 150 average variable cost, and our average fixed cost has come down significantly, and so our average total cost is down to 250. Goes back up slightly, because obviously although our average fixed cost has come down, our average variable cost in this instance has increased at the point at which we're starting to produce 3 units of output. Again, a significant increase caused by average variable costs increasing from 3 units of output to 4, and so that average total cost goes up to 350, and then we end up at 440, where we've got significantly higher average variable cost, but also quite a significant drop in the level of average fixed cost, based on the fact that we're dividing that total of 200 by, in this instance, 5 units of output. Okay, so if we then show how that looks in terms of a graph, we've got this scenario where we've got average fixed costs coming down, as we just talked about. We've got average variable costs increasing over time, and again, you'd expect that as output increases, then your average variable cost is going to probably go up. And then when we combine the two, we've got average total cost, which sort of reflect that same pattern. But hopefully that gives you an idea of the way in which you can show average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost, and the fact that there is clearly a link between those different types of cost. Okay, so that's average total cost. Now we're going to move on and take a look at marginal cost next, which gets slightly more confusing, but it's if you just take it through step by step, it's actually not too difficult. Okay, we've talked overall about how important things are at the margin in economics, and marginal cost and marginal revenue is something that we'll talk about an awful lot over the next few months. So in this instance, we're looking at marginal cost as opposed to marginal revenue, and basically if we wanted to define that, we look at it's basically the cost of producing an extra unit of output, or the change in the total cost divided by the change in output. Okay, so it's an important principle to calculate. If you think about, in this case, it's the marginal cost is the cost of producing another unit of output. So in this instance, if we're talking about the total cost for each of the items here, so if we take a look at the table on page 25, you've got a definition just above that table of what marginal cost is, and then also the way in which you calculate it. So marginal cost is basically the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, and and there is a worked example that you can use there. But what I'd like you to do is using the information from the table that we used previously to complete and plot the values on the grid below. So looking at this, in this instance, we've got output per week in units ranging from 0 to 5. We've got total cost included here, and then we're going to need to calculate our marginal cost for, so essentially the cost for adding another unit of output. So in this instance, we need to bear in mind and remember that our formula is the change in total cost divided by the total change in quantity. So in this instance, clearly, we haven't got any quantity as such, but our total cost is £200 because of our fixed costs. But when we look at the second example then, okay, effectively what we're saying is that the first unit of output cost us £200. The second unit of output cost us, or the extra unit of output cost us £400. So the marginal cost of producing one extra unit is, in this case, 400 minus 200, giving a figure of 200. When we look at the next figure though, okay, where we're talking about 2 units of output, essentially what we're doing is taking our change in total cost. So our change in total cost from unit 1 through to from 1 unit to 2 units is basically 100. Okay, and so the marginal cost of producing that extra unit is just 100. But then when we take a look at the next example at output level 3, we've got a scenario where effectively we've got £300 increase from one unit to the next, which obviously then creates your marginal cost figure. The next one, again, significant increase from 800 to 1400, so that extra unit of output has meant that the marginal cost, the cost of producing one extra unit over and above 3, is a significant amount more. And then finally, for 5 units of output, we're talking about an increase of 800 from 4 to 5. So the marginal cost of producing that extra level of output is 800. Okay, so when we show that on a graph, you can see in this instance we've got the total cost in red, and then we've also got our marginal cost in grey. And that again shows there is some relationship between the total cost and also the marginal cost. So clearly, if the marginal cost for each different level of output is increasing, so that for every extra piece of output that we produce, there is a higher marginal cost, that's obviously going to then mean that the total cost overall will increase too. Okay, so hopefully that sort of makes a reasonable amount of sense. What I'd like you to do next is to take a look at page 26, where we've got some calculation of costs. So we've been given a certain amount of information. So we've got our total fixed cost at no units of output. We've then got our total variable cost, and then we should be able to, with the information that we've been given here, we should be able to fill in the rest of that table. Now you might think initially, well, how the heck do you do that? But if you just think about it and have a go at it, I'd suggest you stop the video and have a go at completing that now, and then obviously we can go through exactly what that looks like when we come to add in the various different figures. Okay, so I'll give you some time to do that, and then obviously you can restart the video and we can then look at the way in which this table might work. Okay, so let's take a look then at the way in which we might be able to fill in the different parts of this table. So first things first, we know our total fixed cost at no units of output is 40, and if it's a fixed cost, we know that it stays the same. So effectively, we can fill in for each of the different levels of output our total fixed cost at 40. Okay, now in this instance, where we've been given other pieces of information, we should then be able to fill in the rest of our table. So effectively, we know our total variable cost at no units of output is going to be 0. But in this instance, our total variable cost from one point to the next, from 3 units of output to 4 units of output, is going to be a combination of 60, and so in this case our total cost has been given to us. We know that 60 is our total cost. We know that our total fixed cost is going to be 40, so the difference between the two in this case is going to be the total variable cost of 20. Okay, and if we then apply that same principle where we've essentially been given our total cost, which is total fixed cost plus total variable cost, that's given us a figure of 66. We know our total fixed cost, which is a part of the total cost, is 40. So in this instance, we've got a total variable cost of 26. Okay, so let's take a look at the next thing then. We can see then that if we're talking about total cost, which is total fixed plus total variable, we've got that information now. So it's in this instance, it's £40 worth of fixed cost, but no variable cost. So that gives a total cost at no units of output of 40. The total cost is 46 for 1 unit of output for that same reason, where we're taking the fixed cost and adding the total variable cost to give a total fixed cost. Total cost overall. Same applies again at 2 units of output. So we're adding our total variable cost to our fixed cost to give 51. And then finally, for 3 units of output, we've got 55, which is made up of £40 worth of fixed cost and £15 worth of variable cost. So you should be able to see that by just taking it step by step that you can actually work a lot of these things out, okay? And particularly when you then give the information across the top here. So the next thing we now need to look at is our average fixed cost. So that's calculated by taking the total fixed cost and dividing it by quantity. So in this instance, you can see that for no units of output, we've got no fixed cost. Oh, sorry, we haven't. We have got average. We've got fixed cost, but we haven't got any average fixed cost because we've produced no quantity as such. Okay, when we then take a look at our average fixed cost for 1 unit of output, we're taking the total fixed cost and then dividing that by the quantity of output. So in this instance, we got 40. So then you can see when we add in that same principle, then we're talking about just £20 worth of average fixed cost when we take that total fixed cost and divide it across units of output. That comes down to 13.3 and then 10 and then 8 for each increase in the level of output. Okay. If we then take a look at average variable cost, so in this case what we're doing is taking our total variable cost, which we've got here, and then dividing that by the quantity. So same principle again. So in this instance, the average variable cost at no quantity is 0 because we clearly haven't produced anything. But then the average variable cost for 1 unit of output is the total variable cost divided by the quantity, which gives us 6. Then we've got 11 as our total variable cost for 2 units of output, which when we divide that by the amount of output, that comes down to 5.5. It then reduces again to 5 for 3 units of output, stays the same for 4 units of output, and then we start to get an increase in our average variable cost once we get to 5 units of output per week. If we then take a look at average cost, so in this case we're taking total cost and dividing it by quantity, or alternatively adding average fixed cost to average variable cost. In this instance, again, the average cost is going to be 0 units of output. In this instance, our average cost is basically our total cost divided by quantity. So we've got a total cost of 46 divided by, in this case, 1. So that obviously is going to be just 46. Significant drop when we've got 2 units of output, because that's reduced down to £25.50. So we're taking basically our average fixed cost of 20, adding 5.5 as our average variable cost to give 25.5. The next one is 18.3, then down to 15, and then down to 13.2. So our average cost is coming down with each unit of output. Okay, if we then take a look at the total or the marginal cost, okay, so the cost of the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, this gives a slightly different picture. So in this instance, obviously, to produce one extra, we've moved from a total cost, a change in total cost of 46 from 40. So that gives a marginal cost for producing that one unit of output of 6. But in this instance, when we're talking about the percentage, the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, our total cost is 51, and basically that's changed from 46. So clearly, our marginal cost has come down by a unit. It's come down by another unit at 3 units per of output per week. But then it starts to go back up again, where we've then got a total cost, or the change in total cost is changed from 55 to 60. And in that instance, we're starting to get marginal cost increasing, and then it's increased again in the scenario that's been shown there. So although it might have seemed that you didn't have enough information to be able to include all of those figures, clearly by just taking it step by step, that's something that you can do. And what I'd like you to take a look at on page 26 is taking that data and then also plotting it for me onto your graphs. Okay, so the first one is the totals. And then at the bottom of the page, there is the averages and the marginals that I want you to plot. And they should look something like the following slides. So I'll give you some time to have a go at that, complete it, and then we'll take a look at what that looks like. So when we're talking about our graph, the two graphs, then we've got total fixed, total variable, and total cost included in the top one. And you can see in this instance, we've got total fixed cost as a horizontal line. We've got total cost being increasing over time, because obviously when we add variable costs in, that clearly is going to have an effect. And you can see that the variable cost line, the total variable cost line, is parallel to the total cost line, and that sort of makes sense too, really. If we then take a look at average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost, again, in this instance, we've got average variable cost staying fairly consistent across the piece, but our average fixed costs are coming down, as you'd expect, as we're producing more output, and then that also then reflects in the average total cost line, which shows again a descending costs overall to the point at which we're starting to show that 5 units of output. Okay, so the next thing then to take a look at, and then I think we will. So we've just got short run costs, and we'll probably just take a look at summarising those costs, and then there are some questions for you to complete, and then that will be it for this particular section. Okay, so again, you've been given some information on capital costs, on labour costs, and also you've been given some ideas of the formulas that you might need to use. Okay, so we've got a marginal cost being the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, and in this case we've been given units of capital, we've got units of labour, and then we've got total output that we've managed to achieve, which is basically the total product, which equals essentially the quantity in this instance. When we're talking about the marginal product, though, that's basically where we're talking about the marginal product is equal to the change in quantity. Okay. So we're going to go through this process reasonably quickly, and then obviously you can take a look at the items that need to be included in this table. Okay, so in the first instance, if we look at marginal product, we can see that basically, remember, that's the change in quantity. In this case, we've gone from no output at all to 20. Then we've got 34, so that's the difference between 20 and 54. So obviously the marginal product, the amount of increase of product caused by, in this case, an increase in the unit of labour has actually increased significantly. Then we've got again a change where we've got higher levels of marginal product. So the difference between 54 and 100 being 46, and on that goes to show that basically we get to the point where up to and including 4 units of labour, we are getting an increase in the marginal product, an increase in the change in quantity, but then from 5 units onwards, when we start to see that starting to diminish somewhat. If we then take a look at the total variable cost then, okay, so total variable cost in this instance, we've got our units of capital, we've got our units of labour, and then we've also got our total total output included. Okay, so clearly in this instance, what we're going to do is calculate the 10 units of capital and times that by the total output to give us 200. That then changes again, where we're talking about the total variable cost in this instance of the number of the total amount of output, and we've also got to bear in mind that we've got capital costs that have been included up here, and also labour costs, which should help you to then do those calculations. Okay, so I'm going to just fill these in, and you should be able to see a pattern emerging. Okay, so total variable cost in this case is going to be £200 per unit. We've got our capital costs at £100 per unit, so basically adding those two together gives you your total variable cost. When we look at total fixed costs, we've been told in this instance, or we've been given the information here to suggest that our total fixed cost is going to be £1,000. Okay, so when we add that £1,000 that gives us picture which actually allows us then to take a look at total cost. In this instance, it's 1,000. In the second instance, where we've got £200 worth of total variable cost and also £1,000 worth of total fixed cost, that obviously is a relatively simple calculation, and our total costs, as you can see, start to mount up based on the calculations that we've been given and the figures that we've been given. Okay, the average variable cost is then going to be based on taking the total cost, total variable cost, and dividing that by the units produced. And so in this instance, that gives us a figure of 10, 7.4 for 2 units of labour, 6 for 3 units, 5.3 for 4, 5.1 for 5, 5.2 for 6, 5.6 for 7, and 6.2 for 8 units of production. Our average fixed cost, remember, that's basically the total fixed cost divided by the quantity. In this instance, we've got 50, and then that falls significantly to 18.5, and then 10, 6.6, 5.1, 4.3, 4, and 3.8. And again, you'd expect that the level of average fixed cost, given the extra amount of output that we produced, will make a significant difference. When we look at average total cost then, if we add the two figures together, average variable and average fixed cost, that gives us 60, 25.9, 16, 11.9, 10.2, 9.6, 9.6, and then 10. So again, our average total cost is falling significantly as we go from 1 unit through to 6 units, but then it starts to sort of stabilize somewhat, or stays the same at 7, and then starts to actually increase. Our average total costs are starting to go up at that point. And then when we take a look at our marginal cost, which is basically the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, again, this gives us quite an interesting pattern of information. So in this instance, for 1 unit of labour, we're talking about a marginal cost of 10. So 1,200 being our total cost, take away total fixed cost, and then divide that by, in this instance, 20. And that gives us a figure of 10. Okay, in the second case, that marginal cost has actually changed down to 5.9. So we've got, in this case, our total cost figure. And remember, we're trying to look at the change in the total cost based on the previous example. So we've got a change from 1,400 to 1,200, and then we're going to divide that by the change in quantity. So we've gone from 54, from 20 to 54 to calculate that. I'm just going to fill the rest of those in so that you can start to see a pattern emerging. And in each instance, you're just applying that same principle. And you can see that our marginal cost, the cost of producing an extra unit of output, comes down significantly from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. But then from 5 upwards, it starts to actually increase, and then makes a significant change from 7 units of labour to the 8th unit. Okay. So again, quite a lot of data there for you to consider, but if we then show what that looks like on a graph, we can see in this instance, and this is on page 28 for you, there is a significant pattern emerging based on plotting those figures. So we've got, in this instance, we've got a total variable, total fixed, and total cost. And again, you get that similar sort of pattern where we've got fixed costs consistent across the board. They stay consistent because they're fixed costs. They don't vary with output. But then we've got our total variable cost and total fixed cost almost in a parallel line. And again, that sort of makes sense. So it mirrors the overall total fixed cost, total cost mirrors the combination of your total fixed cost and your total variable cost. But then when we take a look at the average variable cost, total average fixed cost, and average total cost, you would expect, again, the average total cost to be the highest value, because essentially you're adding your average fixed cost and your average variable cost to calculate your average total cost. Okay. So you can see in this instance there is always going to be a pattern to the shape of these short run cost curves, and there is some information for you to consider, and a stylistic graphical example shown on this next slide. So effectively what we're doing here is showing cost against output, and our total fixed cost is always going to be a horizontal line. Our total variable cost is going to start at the origin, because when we're producing nothing, there's no variable cost as such. And then our total cost is basically taking our total variable cost and then extrapolating that, or adding the total fixed cost, which obviously have to be considered irrespective of the level of output, to give that total cost marginal, well, not so much marginal cost, but certainly the total cost curve and total variable cost and total fixed cost. If we then take a look at the next level then, and we take a look at our average fixed cost and then our average total cost, line, we can then see that when we add in our marginal cost tends to come down initially as our efficiency improves, but then starts to increase like so. Now, effectively, we will start to see it quite a lot of this in the future, where we're talking about marginal cost and also marginal revenue, where we start to look at profit maximisation and the ways in which businesses might try to choose to produce at certain levels in order to maximise the profits that they're achieving. Okay, so those are some examples of the way in which we might stylize both total cost, total variable cost, and total fixed cost curves, but also where we're talking about average fixed cost, average total cost, and also marginal cost. Remember, marginal cost being the cost of adding 1 unit of output to your production. Now, at this point, that you can see that the minimum average cost is the point at which the average cost line is at its lowest. Now, that's clearly quite an important area, in that if businesses can manage to achieve that, then clearly they are operating at their minimum cost, the minimum average cost, which obviously is a good thing to achieve. If we then add in the average cost curve, or the average variable cost, that tends to cause or tends to be the same as average cost, and that obviously then has a bit of an impact too. Okay, so if we're talking about here the point at which our average or our minimum average variable cost is, then clearly that's a point at which we're going to want to try and minimise our average cost and our average variable cost, because if we can do that, we can then hopefully reduce our overall costs, which then hopefully is going to mean that you're going to achieve more sales and then hopefully improve your overall business position. If we then take a look at the total cost gradient, the minimum total cost gradient is at the point at which we've added in that line, that construction line, essentially. So that's the point at which our total cost gradient is at its minimum. So that's the point at which we're hopefully trying to operate, because that clearly gives us again some cost advantages. Okay, now you'll see that there are, on the basis of the information on page 29, there is some data which talks about average and marginal costs and the way in which you might choose to consider how you can draw that up. And then there are a range of multi-choice questions from page 30 and 31 that I'd like you to have a go at. Now, what we'll do at the start of next lesson or the next presentation is to have a look at those exercises and see what you've come up with. Okay, so thanks for listening once more. I'm sorry that was a slightly longer process than I was expecting it to be, but that we've covered quite a lot of content within that. Okay, so I'll catch up with you next time. Thanks.